Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of the Human Thought and Emotion block. And in this lecture today, I will introduce this block to you in a, well, hopefully in an interesting fashion. And contrary to what you may think, this isn't a lecture about Jane Austen. So let me explain what I mean. I use the title Sense and Sensibility for quite a good reason. Now, maybe you have heard of Jane Austen's novel, and there was a movie made from this novel as well. And the title is Sense and Sensibility. What that means is reason or judgment as opposed to emotion or sensitivity. Now, originally, Jane Austen titled this novel Eleanor and Marianne, because Eleanor is a character who represents sense, and Marianne is the character that represents sensibility. But what I want to focus today in this lecture on is that distinction, that very distinction between reason and emotion. It's something that perhaps you have thought about. Maybe you sometimes feel like, my emotions are running wild and I need my reason to control them. And these ideas, these ways of thinking are actually, have a very, very long history. And part of today's lecture is going to be discovering that history and seeing where these ideas came from and whether there's actually much point to them. So let's start with brains. Our brains are supposedly quite amazing. Even though they're not entirely unique, although we really, really like to think of them as unique, they are superior in cognitive abilities when you compare them to brains of other animals. Now, we do think of ourselves as the most cognitively able creature on Earth. And you may have heard it's because we have big brains. But it's not just about big brains or being, the brains being large, because they are not largest brains. I mean, a whale's brain is actually a bit bigger than ours. What actually matters here is that we have quite a lot of neurons, so quite a lot of cells firing and linking together. And coming back to the idea of being human that we started with our whole set of lectures with, the ability to think, to reason, to judge, to create, to science, to use that as a verb, is somehow really defining in terms of being human, as being able to think. But on the other hand, we are also, creatures of emotion. Traditionally, we think of emotions as located in the heart, oh, yay, heart shape. I can't make it. Yeah, there we go. And emotions are something that most of us have experienced. And to be honest, only people with either severe cognitive impairments or kind of psychopaths are unable to experience emotions at all, or people with damaged brains. There may be different ways in which we experience emotions, and various neurodiversities mean that we can experience them in quite a different way. But as humans, we also have an experience of what it means to feel. What emotions are is quite a difficult topic, and we don't have enough time here to talk about it. But the really important thing is that emotions exist in the body and in the brain. In terms of the body, we often see that we have physiological responses. Our body temperature changes, our veins constrict, there's some sort of tightness happening across the body. And if you look at this little image here, this is showing a heat map of what different emotions actually look like when you put them in a scanner and look at the heat and temperature of the body when people are experiencing these emotions. So they are certainly very much a bodily experience, but they're also a brain experience. It is actually in the brain that our emotions take place. They happen, whether it's about the neurotransmitters or higher level cognition. this is where things happen. Now, on top of that, something that isn't on this slide is that emotions are very much tied into our culture. The way we talk about emotions, the way we experience them, is often related to how we define them in our languages in the first place. And we're going to look a little bit more at terms of emotions and the differences in different cultures and historical differences in the third lecture of this series. But today we're focusing mostly on the kind of emotions in general, or feelings, or affect, or however else you want to call it, or passions even. So at the center of this, we have a bit of a conundrum. Are we brains on legs, or are we cucumbers with anxiety? Or is it really sensible to ask that question? Perhaps we're both. But that idea of emotions and thought as somehow, relevant to who we are, either in opposition or playing together, is quite an important idea. And it's often been also tied to the ideas of morality or decision making. Now, our emotions and our thoughts lead us to make certain judgments, and we can judge things as either right or wrong. Whether we're talking about ourselves and thinking, oh my God, I really shouldn't eat that third chocolate bar, or whether we're judging other people and saying, oh, what a bad person. He cut me in front of, he cut in front of me with the car, and how dare he do that? And that's actually a very emotional response because we're probably very angry. So we can be moved by anger and disgust if other people act immorally. We can be moved by shame and embarrassment if it's us. We are doing the thing that we shouldn't be doing. So emotions are tied to morality, and they are tied to thoughts and decision-making processes. We understand that now, but that wasn't always the case. Now, in other ways as well, we can think of feelings and emotions as something that is not just particular to us humans, because if you ever had a dog or a cat or a pet of particularly a mammal pet that lives as a social animal, you'll know that animals have feelings too. And they have feelings of empathy and reciprocity. So, tit for tat, I love you, you love me kind of thing. And these are essential for behaviors in groups of mammals living together. And these emotions in animals can be seen as kind of a counterpart of human morality. But that idea of reason versus emotion as something, distinct, two parts that kind of are opposed to each other is something very much entrenched in our thinking. And we do intuitively understand that our human mind is divided into parts that sometimes are in conflict with one another. And we have that often inner dialogue. We're saying, I should do this or I shouldn't do this, but I really want to. And the devil and the angel on one shoulder and the other shoulder. And in fact, we are not ever in full control of our thoughts, emotions, and even actions. They tend to kind of run away from us. And this is a sentiment and an observation that has been made quite a long time ago. If you think about, for instance, what the Roman poet Ovid wrote in his Metamorphoses in 8 AD, so that's 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago. I am dragged along by a strange new force. Desire and reason are pulling in different directions. I see the right way and approve it, but I follow the wrong. And it is a sentiment that I think most of us will be able to appreciate. But here we have desire that represents emotions or passions, and reason, so that kind of rational being who decides, who takes control. And all of this can actually be traced to a certain Greek philosopher, Plato. And Plato really went very much into this idea of reason and emotion as two distinct things. He also kind of conceptualized or thought about them as two horses pulling a chariot in different directions, and the charioteer tries to make them work as a team. And the charioteer is kind of our willpower in a way. And reason, in his understanding and Plato's understanding, is far superior to emotion. And actually, emotions are really not that great. He expands on that idea in Timaeus, which is a dialogue, and he wrote that in the 4th BC, more or less. And it's a bit of a creation myth. So it's a story about how human beings were created, and the god Demiurge first created human heads, and they were really round and perfect because roundness is perfection. And they were also filled with these perfect rational souls, that pure reason. And okay, but heads can't really exist by themselves. So the lesser gods were tasked with creating bodies for those heads. And those bodies needed to be animated with something, and they got a second kind of inferior soul to help those heads move around in the world. But these second souls were really, nothing in comparison to the first proper super rational souls, because they had all these necessary disturbances like pleasures and pains and boldness and fear and anger and expectation and sense perception and lust. And all of these are really so much in the way. They are necessary to move around in the world, but they're also causing us a lot of hassle, and they're preventing our rational souls from doing the right thing sometimes. So human moral life, according to Plato, is a struggle of these heads to control the bodies by channeling the body's passions towards virtuous ends. So, okay, we have these passions, we have these horses, and we need to guide them into doing what we want them to do. And we're doing that with our kind of detached, non-physical, rational soul. And the ideas of some sort of struggle and battle within us have also been illustrated in a slightly different way in the medieval times. And Prudentius wrote a very famous at the time poem called Psychomachia, which is essentially the battle of the soul. That was a 5th century work. And in this battle of the soul, we have virtues and vices fighting over the possession of human soul. The virtues and vices, you'll recognize quite a lot of the vices as our emotions, and quite a lot of the virtues are the control that we can exert over these emotions. And in particular, one really good example is anger. And anger is here seen in that lovely image from the 10th century Old English manuscript, with wild hair and being, I have a sword and a shield and I'm just going to, attack, because that's what anger does. But anger breaks her sword on Patience's head. And Patience is like, whoa, I got this, anger. I am better than you. Your sword will break. So this is an illustration that is tied to religious thinking, and that the ideas of sins and vices, and the fact that in order to be a moral human being, you need to control these vices. It's the virtues that need to kind of get on top in your head and in your soul. But nothing really illustrates that kind of really, really huge division between the heart or the soul, or the mind and the body, and the mind and the emotions, as the philosopher Rene Descartes, 17th century French philosopher. And you may have heard of one of his most famous phrases, "I think, therefore I am." So cogito ergo sum. Now, this idea of thinking associated with being also gave rise to what is called Cartesian dualism. So the fact that we have a thinking mind and soul, and that is immaterial. And this is in opposition to a physical body. And in his Passions of the Soul, Descartes said that, reason is enough to guide our actions. And a well-informed mind, a knowledgeable mind will be capable of making good choices just on the basis of that knowledge. And passions are just in the way. Um, they are to be understood. You have to understand them, but you need to understand them in order to control them and let reason do what reason is supposed to do. And this kind of thinking really dominated Western thought, Western European thought for centuries. This idea that there is reason and there are emotions or passions, and they're not playing together at all. But eventually we see that actually there are some voices of dissent, that some people don't agree with that. And one of them was David Hume, a kind of Scottish 18th century philosopher. And he says, our mental perceptions of the world, yes, they are created by two things: the thoughts, so the reason, and impressions, which are sensations and feelings. However, he inverts what Descartes or Plato have said. He says, actually, no, it's reason is not as important. It's the emotions that are important. Reason should be a slave or servant to the passions and can never pretend to do anything else other than serve and obey them. So what he says, and linking it with moral judgment, is that moral judgments are a little bit like aesthetic judgments. So, if you see a pretty flower or a pretty painting, you immediately recognize it as a pretty painting. It moves you emotionally. It gives you that feeling, aesthetic feeling. And moral judgments are very similar to that, because we get that immediate feeling. We have some sort of finer internal sense that knows that things are right or that they are wrong. And it's not about, having a rational chain of argument, of reasoning that you put one after the other. It is about that feeling that is within you. So this is quite the opposite, isn't it? And we'll who was right? Was Descartes right, or was Hume right? Well, let's find out in a moment. But before we do, we kind of need to have a look at yet another perspective on this, and one that is expressed, first by Charles Darwin, and then by the following ideas that are found in evolutionary psychology. As I mentioned, it's not only humans that feel, animals feel as well. But what Darwin has done in his 19th century work on the expressions of emotions in man and animals was to look specifically at facial expressions and at the kinds of faces that we make to communicate emotions. And this is something quite different from what we had previously in philosophy, where emotions, passions, feelings were something internal, introspective. You would be just, tossed around by them. But it's not so much about the expression. Now, what Darwin does is focuses on the expression of emotions. And that means that if emotions are expressions that can be visibly seen, well, they have a certain function, and that function is to communicate. And emotions evolve in social animals because that communication in the social group increases chances of survival, because we can keep the group together. And other evolutionary psychologists were investigating the different emotional expressions, different faces that we make, and tried to attach to them some sort of communicative function. Happiness or smiling might be communicating a lack of threat. Sadness or might be, signal that there's something wrong with you and you need sympathy, you need help. Fear is to do with threats and aggression, but appeasing aggressors. Anger communicates dominance, and so on and so forth. So each of these emotions, according to some psychologists, has a function, and communicates a communicative function. So we're seeing that emotions are perceived in quite a lot of different ways, especially around the intersection of our rational self as well. And one of the biggest advances in our understanding of how emotions work comes from Antonio Damasio in 1994, and can be really neatly encapsulated in what he said, that we are feeling beings who think. So rather we are than, as Descartes said, we are thinking beings first and foremost. This is the other way around. We are feeling beings who think. And Antonio Damasio, actually, his book in which he explains all this has been, he called it the Descartes Error. So why was Descartes wrong? So kind of roasting Descartes a little bit there. And what Damasio has found through empirical research is that actually rationality requires both cognition and emotion. We can't have one without the other. And this is based on observations of patients who had some sort of damage to their brain. Now, that damage was located in a specific area of the brain that is kind of highlighted there in the blue. It's called ventromedial prefrontal cortex, if you need to know, but probably not. And patients were, patients that Damasio had some sort of damage to that area of the brain. They were still completely rational. They had still retained all their, the level of IQ. They were intelligent. They had a full knowledge of right and wrong. But actually, they had no emotions. If you showed them something that normally would make other people happy or sad or angry, they're just completely blank and not feeling any of these emotions. Now, the problem that occurred very quickly was that actually it turned out that these people were very bad at making decisions. They couldn't make decisions, or they made really bad decisions. Because without that kind of emotional prod or guidance or intuition to tell them what is right and wrong, every single option seemed equally right and had to be debated and, thought about. And to give a kind of slightly gruesome example that another author that I'm going to talk about in a moment gives in his book is, it's almost like if you were contemplating murdering someone close to you and didn't immediately recoil at the thought, emotionally. It's like, no, why would I? It's wrong. It's wrong. I'm not going to even think about it. People with these kinds of damages to their brain would be like, okay, well, if I kill my best friend, I probably won't be able to go to the cinema with them. So it's almost like the kind of process that you would have if you were trying to buy a fridge and couldn't decide whether you wanted this brand or the other brand. That emotional kind of level was completely gone, and therefore these people couldn't make proper decisions. And this kind of completely overturns the idea of people like Plato or Descartes, that really it's the reason that guides the emotions, and the emotions are just not really helpful in reasoning. And on the kind of spur of that, those ideas, we're reaching kind of more modern days, and Jonathan Haidt's work. He's a social and cultural psychologist, and he very much investigates morality and emotions and how they work in social contexts. And in his early work, he really struggled with that kind of cognition versus emotion distinction, because he couldn't see it in his experiments. He couldn't make the dual model work with reason actually acting independently of emotion. And he started thinking about it in a slightly different way. Sorry. What has happened? Something has gone horribly wrong. Apologies for that. There we go. So he had a set of experiments, and I am going to warn you that what I'm going to present right now is not going to be easy. There is a bit of a content warning here, because his scenarios are essentially what he calls harmless taboo scenarios. So things that in our cultures or in general are just plain wrong, but actually they don't cause any actual harm. So first of all, I mean, there is a distinction between kind of rational and gut feeling. And these harmless taboo scenarios are aimed at kind of going in the middle. So what I'm going to present to you is one of such scenarios. And what I would like you to do is to, well, read it carefully and think about how does it make you feel? What do you feel and why do you feel that way? So two questions. How do you feel? Why do you feel that way? So here is the scenario. Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They are traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night they are staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about that? Was it okay for them to make love? So this is the scenario that Haidt presented with his assistant to quite a large number of people. And of course, immediately, I'm guessing we will all have pretty much the same reaction as in, ew, no, or, that's not quite right, is it? Maybe even a stronger reaction than that. And that is the case for probably around 80% of people who were presented with that kind of scenario. And incest is something taboo in our cultures. We don't like that idea. But the interesting question comes, why? Why not? And what the follow-up on this was that the interviewer, the experimenter, started asking these people questions, kind of, okay, but why do you think this way? And what you can observe in these conversations is something really interesting about emotions, thoughts, and morality. So here's the interview transcribed. So what do you think about this? Was it wrong for Julie and Mark to have sex? Yeah, I think it's totally wrong to have sex, because I'm pretty religious and I just think incest is wrong anyway. But I don't know. What's wrong with incest, would you say? Well, the whole idea of, well, I've heard, I don't even know if it's true, but in the case, if the girl did get pregnant, the kids become deformed most of the time in cases like that. But they used a condom and birth control pills. Oh, okay, yeah, you did say that. So there's no way they're going to have a kid. Well, I guess the safest sex is abstinence. But I don't know. I just think that's wrong. I don't know. What did you ask me? Was it wrong for them to have sex? Yeah, I think it's wrong. And I'm trying to find out why you think is what you think is wrong with it. Okay, well, let's see. Let me think about this. How old were they? They were college age, around 20 or so. Oh, okay. I don't know. It's just not something you're brought up to do. It's just not, well, I mean, I wasn't. I assume most people aren't. I just think that you shouldn't. I guess my reason is that you're not brought up to it. You don't see it. It's not, I don't think it's accepted. That's pretty much it. You wouldn't say anything you're not brought up to see is wrong, would you? For example, if you're not brought up to see women working outside the home, would you say that makes it wrong for women to work? Well, oh gosh, this is hard. I really am. I mean, there's just no way I could change my mind, but I just don't know how to show what I'm feeling, what I feel about it. It's crazy. So this interview is interesting in a lot of different ways. First of all, the respondent, the subject, immediately says this is wrong. This is his or her opinion on the subject. That's how they feel about it. And the interviewer, the experimenter, is trying to find out why and keeps asking kind of pointed questions. And what we're seeing is that the subject keeps backtracking and changing the reasons and kind of throwing as many reasons as possible to justify that initial reaction of, no, it's wrong. And they're not changing their mind about it, even though each and every rational argument or rational reason that they're giving is being shot down by the experimenter. So the way in which these scenarios are created by Haidt and his associates are exactly to elicit that kind of response and then what they saw was that is exactly the pattern that the subjects were following, trying to kind of flounder a little bit, being very lost, backtracking, giving lots of different reasons, and not changing their minds. Now, what that led Haidt to believe and see is that actually we make judgments on the basis of our intuitions and emotions initially first, and we then rationalize them after the fact. So, kind of a little bit more like what Hume was saying. So, emotions aren't opposed to cognition because emotions are a kind of information processing, they are kind of cognition. It's just that we have two different types of cognition. Um, there is one that is conscious, that is reasoning, that is following that kind of if A, then B, if this, I give that reason. But we also have a lot of automatic processes that are essentially intuitive and based in part on our emotions. And Haidt gives a very, very interesting metaphor of our whole mind as this elephant and rider. So you have the rider, that's our mind, that's our conscious brain, that's our rationality. And we have the elephant. And the elephant is all those unconscious automatic intuitions and emotions. And well, the elephant weighs 6 tons. It's a powerful beast and it'll go where it wants. I mean, the rider can steer it, can convince it maybe to go this way. But if you're trying to push an elephant, you're not going to manage. And this is how our brains are essentially. We have all this kind of automatic intuitive thinking that we are not realizing is intuitive. But our brains, our conscious minds are very good at then, after the fact, rationalizing what we're doing. So, where does that leave us? In the battle of reason versus emotions, we can see that, even though quite a lot of what modern sciences are doing, neuropsychology, evolutionary psychology, and so on, and they have shown that emotions and cognition are actually tied together. They go hand in hand. They are crucial for our decision making, for our communication, quite a lot of our lives. We are still left with that cultural historical legacy of thinking about reason and emotions as separate and distinct entities that are kind of in opposition to one another. And such depictions are actually very, very common in literature and art and even in pop culture. And we need to learn to recognize them and understand what kind of story they are telling and observe if they are changing as more and more science filters through to the kind of general consciousness, and whether that in any way changes what is being represented. So with that, I think that is it. And I hope you feel well, and I hope your elephants are not kicking up a fuss. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and well, see you later.